It is officially official. Desmond Ridder is the Falcons' new starting quarterback, and we'll be breaking down Arthur Smith's reasoning behind it, if he's going to take the training wheels off the Falcons' rookie quarterback, and we'll also be breaking down which Falcons are deserving of going to this year's Pro Bowl.
You are Locked On Falcons, your daily Atlanta Falcons podcast. Part of the Locked On Podcast Network, your team every day.
So, guys, you know me. I'm Aaron Freeman, a.k.a. Mr. Drew, a.k.a. Sirius Black, and a.k.a. your very humble host here of this illustrious Locked On Falcons podcast, part of the Locked On Sports Atlanta podcast family, your team every day. And today's episode of Locked On Falcons is sponsored by Simply Safe Home Security with Fast Protect technology exclusively from Simply Safe. 24/7 monitoring agents capture evidence to accurately verify a threat for faster police response. There's no safe like Simply Safe. Visit simplysafe.com/LockedOnNFL to learn more. So, guys, we thank you for making Locked On Falcons your first listen each and every day. Of course, Locked On Falcons is free and available Monday through Friday on a variety of podcast platforms, including on YouTube. Make sure you subscribe to Locked On Falcons on YouTube. We got to get those subscribers up, guys. We're still not past 4,000 subscribers. You guys are sleeping on this podcast, right? And the subscriptions as well. You can also check us out on YouTube and Roku and Amazon Fire TV by downloading the Locked On Sports Atlanta app. You can still check out Locked On Falcons as well as the other local shows like Locked On Hawks and Locked On Bulldogs as well on Roku and Amazon Fire TV. So the reason why you got to subscribe, guys, is because you make Locked On Falcons your first listen. And today we got confirmation from Arthur Smith that he also makes Locked On Falcons his first listen, because he basically was talking about, he officially announced the move that we had heard leaked on Thursday morning that, Desmond Ridder is the Falcons QB1 from now on. And he was breaking down his reasoning behind it. And he was echoing a lot of the sentiments you've heard me talk about over the last few days and or weeks here on the podcast. And so Arthur Smith insisted that this decision to go from Marcus Mariota to Desmond Ridder was a performance-based decision, and essentially mentioned that they're looking for a spark, right? And the other thing that he mentioned was using the words evolving the passing game, something that we've talked about on this podcast for 2 months now, and basically trying to get over the hump and hoping that Ridder can provide that spark to get this passing game to be a little bit more balanced with where the running game is at. And he talked about how Desmond Ridder has shown growth over the course of the season, and they're very comfortable with him operating the entirety of the offense, right? That Arthur Smith mentioned that if they thought that they were going to have to restrict him, it wouldn't be fair to the rest of the team. So, while there are already training wheels on the Falcons offense based off of, how much they run the football, it does seem like there's not going to be additional ones now that they have a rookie quarterback in the lineup with Desmond Ridder, and going to feel like, okay, we can't do X, because he's too young, he's too inexperienced or any of that. It feels like they're going to operate the entirety of the offense as they have operated. And potentially, we'll talk a little bit later about the potential and the possibility that they could, expand how they're operating the offense a little bit later on today's episode. But, the other thing that Arthur Smith mentioned, again, something that has been discussed on Locked On Falcons a number of times over the last couple of weeks, is the offensive line's progression makes him feel a lot more confident, makes the switch to Desmond Ridder easier, because he doesn't necessarily feel like, he's going to go out there and be torn apart by the wolves, which is the analogy that we've used several times on this podcast over the last couple of months. Although Arthur Smith did not say that, because that would have been too much of an indicator, and he can't let it on that, his favorite podcast and his first listen each and every day is Locked On Falcons. But that's something that we've talked about, that the offensive line has not given up, has been one of the better teams in the NFL. If you look at websites like PFF in terms of limiting pressure over the last couple of games. And so that's a positive sign. Now, the other news of the day involving the other quarterback, Marcus Mariota, is that it looks like he's headed to injured reserve. Now, Arthur Smith insisted that that had nothing to do with the Falcons' quarterback switch. It adds further context to the decision behind signing Logan Woodside on Saturday from the Titans practice squad. We mentioned on yesterday's episode that Woodside was signed likely to run the scout team. That's still going to be probably the case, but he'll also be the team's number 2 quarterback if Mariota is heading to IR. And the reason why Mariota is headed to IR is he's seemingly getting a chronic, as Arthur Smith called it, knee injury looked at. He's going to be evaluated, maybe get scoped, maybe get surgery, whatever the case may be. And, that led to a lot of speculation, like, why are we hearing about this now? And, that's just the way it is when it comes to NFL injury reports. Just because a player does not appear on an injury report does not mean that a player is not injured. The injury reports are basically telling you who's practiced, right? It doesn't mean that you're not hurt. It means that you're healthy. If you're not on an injury report, you're healthy enough to practice, but that doesn't necessarily indicate that the player is hurt. And so I'm guessing, Mariota was dealing with an injury. I remember there was a game early in the season, somewhere around middle of the season, where he took a vicious shot to his knee on a run there. And he's probably been playing through this injury and dealing with that. And now, because he's basically being shut down for the year, it does give him the opportunity to get a procedure done, which wouldn't have been the case with him being the starting lineup and being expected to play every week. But now he'll have that opportunity, and we'll see how that goes. So, the other interesting tidbit talking about the quarterback switch is that Arthur Smith confirmed, based off of the timing of the quote unquote leak, that he did talk to Marcus Mariota on Thursday morning, which was the same time around when we saw the initial reports from the various NFL insiders, as well as the local media folks that confirmed that that switch was happening, which we discussed on Thursday night's episode on YouTube and Friday morning's episode on your preferred podcast platform elsewhere. And so that indicates sort of, confirming the timing that information got out. And I remember someone asking me over the weekend, do you think the Falcons purposely leaked that information? And my conclusion was probably not. People talk, agents talk, players talk, people are texting people constantly. Arthur Smith is constantly hitting me up in the text message. Oh, wait, I wasn't supposed to say it. No, I'm kidding, guys. But we'll leave the quarterback conversation there, just sort of confirming some of the things that we've been discussing and some of the reasons why we have been talking about the team making the switch. And we'll talk a little bit about some of the players that may be helping Desmond Ridder come back from injury as he makes his debut, as well as if we'll see Desmond Ridder slinging it all around the yard in his first NFL start. But one player that will not be coming back from injury is Damian Williams, the Falcons running back. He was cut today, according to Adam Schefter, after being on IR since I think week 2, after injuring his ribs in that season opener against the Saints. And maybe that opens up a spot for Nate Landman to return to the Falcons roster after he was cut in favor of Logan Woodside. Or maybe that means one of these offensive linemen that's currently on injured reserve will be activated back to the 53-man roster later this week. So we'll get into some of that as we continue today's episode, guys. But first, I want to talk about your number one source for sports betting info, stats, news, and analysis. I'm, of course, talking about betonline.net. And since I know you guys love sports podcasts, just like Arthur Smith, you can find those as well at BetOnline. And if you're looking for this week's line for the Falcons and the Saints, the Falcons are 4-point underdogs to the Saints on the road. An understandable line given the unknown status of Desmond Ridder, but we're feeling particularly frisky about Desmond Ridder and his potential debut here on Locked On Falcons. So if you're feeling frisky, or you're sitting here going, Aaron doesn't know what he's talking about, which I know many of you do think on a daily basis when you make us your first listen, you can head on over to betonline.net, get the latest odds and trends for every professional sports league and amateur league out there, from the NFL to college bowl season to basketball, World Cup, esports. They got you covered at betonline.net. They're always the fastest and easiest way to get your betting info. So head to the website today, use your mobile device to learn more. BetOnline, where the game starts. So, guys, I do want to talk about the potential changes to the offense we may see with Desmond Ridder this week. But first, let's talk about some of the players that are coming back healthy. Arthur Smith indicated Elijah Wilkinson is expected back this week. He started practicing a week ago, or 2 weeks ago, I think, and should presumably now, with the aid of the bye week, be eligible to come back to the 53-man roster. And so, that may lend itself to, or I guess Damon Williams was on IR, so I guess there isn't a roster spot open. But anyway, in addition to Elijah Wilkinson, there may be more roster moves later this week. We'll talk about them if they are made. Matt Hennessy is potentially coming back from IR, so he may get designated for return. I don't know if he'll be activated to the 53-man roster, but that will shore up the guard position. Chuma Adoga's status is a little bit up in the air, so that will be something that Arthur Smith indicated they'll monitor as the rest of the week goes. But if Wilkinson and Hennessy are back healthy practicing, they should be good to go at that left guard position, in addition to Kobe Gossett. Jalen Dalton and Arnold Ebiketie, who both missed the Steelers game, are also expected back healthy this week. So, no team is fully healthy in week 15 of NFL season, but as far as guys healthy enough to practice, as we just discussed, the Falcons seemingly should look pretty good this week, but we'll keep an eye on that as the rest of the week unfolds. And I think that's a very promising sign with the offensive line improvement that we've been discussing, that, one of the things that we discussed is you feel better about Ridder getting his start if he has, the Falcons full starting five with Elijah Wilkinson back healthy, given the revolving door at that left guard position, which has been, up and down. But, it does feel like Wilkinson will give you a better option there. It's not like Wilkinson, has been playing great football this season. You could argue that he was the weak link of the Falcons' original starting five, but I think the gap between him and whoever's fourth, probably Drew Dalman, probably was a lot smaller than the gap was between say a Drew Dalman and a Kobe Gossett. And then you factor in that Wilkinson played reasonably well, as I recall, in that week 1 game against the Saints. So that's a good thing for Desmond Ridder heading into this week's game. But let's talk a little bit about, the potential scheme changes, right? And as Arthur Smith said, there's not going to be a whole lot of difference, in how this offense is going to operate with Desmond Ridder versus with Marcus Mariota. Now, we've discussed again that, you could argue that there are already training wheels on this offense, given, how much the Falcons run the football, how much they use play action passing. But it does seem like they're not going to add additional training wheels, if you get my drift, on this offense with Desmond Ridder in the lineup. And this was something that was discussed in the Locked On Falcons Discord over the weekend, which you guys can find a link to in the description below. But, we were kind of talking about how, what do we expect on that opening drive? And so, myself and others were kind of fantasizing, and you can, tell me if you think this is a realistic fantasy or if you have similar fantasies. It's a safe space to discuss these things here on Locked On Falcons, guys. But it would be nice to sort of see Desmond Ridder, dialing up a deep shot, early in this game against the Saints, and, potentially his first pass to get some of those Matt Ryan parallels when his first pass was a touchdown on a skinny post to Michael Jenkins. And would it be nice to sort of see Desmond Ridder dialing up a play action deep shot to say, Drake London for a 40+ yard gain or whatever? And again, that may be a fantasy, and instead it's probably more realistic that, Arthur Smith will try to sort of dial up something, much more conservative, like a 3-yard screen pass to Drake London, or of course the Falcons unicorn of a tight end and Michael Pruitt as potentially his first play there. But it would be nice to sort of see the Falcons going, hey, like, one of the big areas that we were struggling with under Marcus Mariota is that deep ball. And, our confidence in Desmond Ridder being the guy, nothing would signal that more than if they dialed up one of those deep balls and he was able to sort of hit that. And when you look at, Desmond Ridder, he wasn't necessarily an elite deep ball thrower in college, but that feels like something that, if he can be effective in that arena, that's going to be something that potentially could unlock the full potential of this Falcons offense, and especially their passing attack, because we know, again, they're going to be still a run-heavy football team, but as defenses sort of stack the box, if you're able to threaten them deep and go over the top and force them to unstack that box because they're worried about the deep ball, all of a sudden, that only enhances your running game. So these two things kind of work hand in hand. And so, again, I don't think Desmond Ridder was a great deep ball vertical thrower watching the film in Cincinnati, and there really wasn't a whole lot to glean from his vertical throwing in the preseason. But, the bar is not too high based off of where we were with Marcus Mariota in that arena, because he was one of the league's weakest deep ball throwers this past season. He completed only 27% of his 20-plus yard throws, according to PFF, which was second worst to Kyler Murray this season. And what it kind of exacerbated that inaccuracy that made him arguably the worst deep ball thrower is that he was pushing the ball down the field a lot more than Kyler Murray this year. And Mariota was sixth in the NFL, according to PFF, in terms of the highest percentage of his passes being those vertical throws. So there's a lot of opportunities there that were left on the field with Marcus Mariota at the helm, and we wonder if Desmond Ridder can, live up to those opportunities, take advantage of those opportunities. And again, he doesn't have to be elite at throwing the football. If he's just kind of average, right, that would be a big improvement for this Falcons offense. We discussed this previously on the podcast, but for those of you that didn't listen to that episode a couple of weeks ago, I basically broke down that if Mariota was an average deep ball thrower and completing about 40% of his vertical throws, he would have 19 completions on those 20-plus yard throws instead of the 13 that he has. And you may look at the difference of, okay, what's the 6 deep balls really, do for you at first glance? But my research indicates that the Falcons, on drives that include a 20-plus yard play, are averaging about 4 points per drive. And so if you sprinkle those 6 deep balls across, multiple games on different drives, that's, 24 points. Again, not a massive improvement, but when you factor in how many of the Falcons games have come down to, single possessions in one-score games, the Falcons are 4-6 this year in one-score games. They're actually 4-4 in games that were decided by 4 points or less. So one deep ball here or there could do a whole lot. And all of a sudden, maybe the Falcons are 6-2 in those 4-point games, or even better in those types of games. And so it does feel like, that is where this team can really get more out of their offense under Desmond Ridder, in addition to maybe just being a little bit more efficient on third downs and in the red zone and, on early downs and all those things that come along with throwing the football. So, I don't expect Desmond Ridder to be pushing the ball down the field nearly as much as Mariota was, but I don't necessarily know if that, following on the point made by Arthur Smith, that's going to be by design. Like, he's going to be like, okay, we're not throwing the ball down the field. It just felt like, particularly early in the season, Mariota was just kind of unleashing those dragons, so to speak, early and often. And so just, natural inclination means that he doesn't have to push the ball down the field nearly to the degree that Mariota was trying. It's not to say that, those deep shots from Mariota were unnecessary, but it did seem at times, certainly earlier in the season than maybe over the last month or so, that he was probably a tad aggressive when it came to taking those shots down the field. But, certainly I would love to see Desmond Ridder, tasteful shots down the field. Just be tasteful about it, and hitting some of those. So that would certainly be a very big statement, in terms of what Desmond Ridder can do with this offense, and certainly against the team's biggest rival. That would be a great statement for those of us out there that, are hoping for great things with Desmond Ridder at the helm. So that's where we'll leave that conversation, guys. And up next, we'll talk about which Falcons besides Chris Lindstrom are going or deserving of making the Pro Bowl. We'll look at my Pro Bowl ballot, and we'll talk a little bit further about how Lindstrom's ability to make the Pro Bowl could potentially impact his contract negotiations after this season. And we'll get into all of that, guys, as we continue today's episode. But first, I want to tell you about Prize Picks, a fun new way to play daily fantasy. All you got to do is pick 2 to 5 players, and if they score more or less than their Prize Picks projection, you can win up to 10 times your money on your entry. It takes less than 60 seconds to enter. And this week, looking at Desmond Ridder's Prize Picks projection, they're asking you, do you think he'll get more or less than 172.5 yards passing, which is slightly more than what Mariota's average per game this year. It was about 170.7 yards per game. So if you feel like Ridder's debut will be a better than average game from him compared to Marcus Mariota, you might want to take more. or you might want to take less if you feel differently. You also may look at Cordero Patterson's projection of 44.5 yards rushing as a potential opportunity for you, given that he had 120 yards rushing in that week 1 game against the Saints and was a dominant performer and certainly the MVP of that game for the Falcons. And the great thing about Prize Picks is whether, everybody listening to this podcast feels that more or less on those projections, it's not you versus the other people. It's just you versus the projections. And they offer projections for any sport you watch: NFL, NBA, World Cup, PGA, NHL, college football, so much more. Prize Picks is safe, it's fast, it's easy. It's currently in operation in 30 states in the US and Canada. All you got to do is download the Prize Pick app or go to prizepicks.com and sign up with the promo code Locked On, and you'll get a 100% instant deposit match up to $100. So if you deposit $100, Prize Picks will give you $100. Don't forget to use that promo code Locked On at sign up for an instant deposit match up to $100. So guys, I believe this upcoming Thursday, maybe Friday, if I'm not mistaken, is the deadline for fan voting for the Pro Bowl this year. And in past years, I've done one of these episodes usually in the first or second week of December when that deadline is approaching, and sort of break down my entire Pro Bowl ballot. I'm not going to do that. So I guess I was lying to you earlier and talking about who's going to be on my ballot. But we'll just focus on the Falcons players that I think are deserving of potentially being on my ballot. I did not put in a ballot. Maybe I will later this week. But usually I don't put in a ballot, but the last couple of years I have, only for the content here on your first listen each and every day here on Locked On Falcons. But Chris Lindstrom is basically the only Falcon player that I would probably have on my ballot that I think is definitely deserving of going to the Pro Bowl. Now, Cordero Patterson would also be on my ballot, particularly as a return specialist, but he's not eligible for return specialists on the Pro Bowl ballot. And I would probably argue that even despite that, if he had stayed healthy for the entire year, I'd probably also just vote for him as a running back just because, to make up for that. But coupled with the fact that I think he's number 1 in the league in success rate this year among running backs also is, again, maybe he might not have the most yards, but that would be justification enough in addition to his kickoff return skills. So he would be a guy that I would say would be technically deserving of that return specialist role and potentially running back role if he'd stayed fully healthy. But unfortunately he hadn't. Avery Williams is a player that is eligible for the Falcons return specialist spot, but I probably wouldn't put Williams on my ballot. I'd probably give that NFC spot to, if I'm not giving it to Patterson, I'd probably go with Nwangu, the Vikings kickoff returner who took one back to the house a couple of weeks ago. But I certainly would not argue with anybody who did put Avery Williams on their Pro Bowl ballot. I think he's, he'd probably be the bronze medalist, I guess, in my pro. He'd be the honorable mention in that regard, simply because of the fact that he's leading the NFL in punt return average. So I think that is certainly deserving if other people would put other honorable mentions that I would go with. Grady Jarrett, I feel like Grady Jarrett got off to a great start. I remember Jarvis saying this early in the season, talking about Grady Jarrett's going to be an all-pro player, but he's kind of slowed down since then, and unfortunately he wasn't able to keep that momentum. But I would give him an honorable mention here, given how well he has played at various points this season. But basically, really ever since that, horrible call against the Bucs, we just really haven't seen, consistent high-level play from Grady Jarrett this season, or at least as we saw earlier in the season. Younghoe Koo would be another player that I think would be a solid honorable mention. Doesn't feel like he's having, that sort of Pro Bowl caliber year that we've seen the last couple of seasons, but he's just only a notch below that, particularly with, I think he's leading the league or top 2. I think maybe the Dallas kicker is actually leading the league in terms of made field goals beyond 50 yards this season. So that's a strong indicator. Clearly the theme is, special teamers is really where the Falcons have more players that have shined this year compared to the rest of the league. Unfortunately, Liam McCullough, the Highlander, would not be on my Pro Bowl ballot like Josh Harris was a year ago. And mostly that's due to not because of a snapping issue, but part of the reason why Harris was like PFF's highest graded long snapper last year was because of how valuable he was in coverage. And McCullough just doesn't have that same value when it comes down to, chasing down punt returners down the field. He just doesn't have quite the speed that Josh Harris has, but he has absolutely filled, that hole as far as snapping goes. So certainly another sort of honorable mention. But circling back to Chris Lindstrom and talk a little bit more about the type of season he's had, and obviously the reason why he's deserving of being a Pro Bowl player is he's Pro Football Focus's #1 graded guard. He's the #2 graded offensive lineman overall, only behind Trent Williams. He's the highest graded run blocker among guards, and #2 again behind Trent Williams in offensive lineman overall. He's number 15 among guards in pass protection according to PFF. And those PFF grades, you guys know, they're always controversial, right? And watching the film, I haven't really looked too much at Chris Lindstrom and thought like, oh, he's playing so much better this year than he was a year ago that deserves him to get those grades instead of having like whatever it was last year, like an 85 last year. Now he's like a 90 something. I don't know what exactly that difference is. I think one thing that has stood out to me this year compared to last year is it does feel like his second level blocking has been significantly better this season, getting out there and climbing that second level and taking out linebackers and whatnot. Has been much better this season than it had been in previous years. But other than that, and again, I don't know how much that influences a PFF grade, but other than that, it does seem like it's mostly the same from last year. Maybe he's a little bit more consistent in pass protection. He had a little bit of up and downs early last season or early this season and late last year. And so maybe you flip those things. And so maybe he's a little bit more consistent this year. But one of the things I'll probably wind up doing after the season is actually going back and grading the run blocking as part of my process to get ready for the offensive line positional breakdown. And so I'll double check to see if he's deserving of these elite run blocking grades. But then you sort of look at the PFF stuff and you're like, what does a 92 grade mean versus an 85 grade versus a 78 grade or anything like that? And we know that their grading system can be a little wonky because last year they had Matt Hennessy as the #2 highest graded run blocking center last year. And it was like, I thought Hennessy's run blocking was good last year, but it was like 89 and that's basically elite. And I'm like, he wasn't an elite run blocker in that regard. So, all that to sit here and say, like, when I see things like, oh, Chris Lindstrom is the best guard in the NFL, it's like, maybe, I don't know, like, based off of PFF stuff, sure. I don't know if I would agree with that opinion, but you guys know how I like to form my own opinions. But regardless of whether he's #1 or whatever, he's still definitely deserving of being in the Pro Bowl this year. He was on my Pro Bowl ballot last year. So if he's been as good, if not better, this year, then he's absolutely deserving of being in the Pro Bowl. And one of the things we talked about on yesterday's podcast, talking about the offseason strategy plans and holes and whatnot, we talked a little bit about Lindstrom's contract extension that is likely to come at some point this upcoming offseason. And I do think a Pro Bowl trip for him could go a long way to enhancing his negotiation stance, the leverage that he has in negotiation. And I think it'll be interesting to see if he does wind up making the Pro Bowl, because some of the early voting announcements from when the voting started, I guess a month or so ago, it didn't seem like he was on track to make the Pro Bowl this year. And so I'll be curious to see if he actually does wind up making the Pro Bowl. If he doesn't, I would still be pretty confident that once we get to January in the Associated Press, they'll probably give him an All-Pro this year, which is not unheard of for a player to not make the Pro Bowl and get an All-Pro. I think AJ Terrell was like second team All-Pro last year after not making the Pro Bowl, if I'm not mistaken. Correct me if I'm wrong in the comments. But, I think the Pro Bowl will help his negotiation stance, because you look at some of the recent contracts signed by guards over the last year or two. We just had Quentin Nelson set the new mark for the highest paid guard in the league, signing his contract extension before week 1 of this year with a $20 million a year extension, and got $60 million guaranteed as part of that. The next highest paid guard in the NFL also signed this past offseason. That was Brandon Scherf, whose contract with the Jaguars is averaging $16.5 million a year with about $30 million guaranteed. And it's notable because Nelson made the Pro Bowl all 4 years before he signed that extension this past year. Scherf was a 5-time Pro Bowler before getting that contract from the Jaguars this year. And so you kind of look at it, if Lindstrom has 0 Pro Bowls, is he, will the Falcons be like, well, we're not going to pay you $20 million or whatever, something like that. Again, I don't know. But You look at sort of the number 3 highest paid guard, that's Joel Bitonio, who did have a Pro Bowl under his belt before signing a $16 million contract extension. From what I gather, looking at overthecap.com, Joe Thuney is the highest paid guard in the NFL that does not have a Pro Bowl bid or an All-Pro bid at $16 million a year that he signed with the Chiefs 2 years ago. And then I'm looking at the rest of the offensive linemen. Raiders left tackle Colton Miller is the highest paid of all the offensive linemen that has 0 Pro Bowls and 0 All-Pros. And his contract that he signed with the Raiders, I think this offseason, was $18 million a year with $42.5 million guaranteed. So, it does feel like if Lindstrom does not make the Pro Bowl this year, or potentially in a world where he doesn't make the All-Pro as well, like, can he go and say, give me more money than Quentin Nelson, who has 4 Pro Bowls under his name versus 0? I don't know. But he could certainly say, look, Colton Miller just got $18 million a year, and so that's not $20 million a year like Nelson, but give me 18 and 45 million guaranteed or something like that. And that, I think, would be something that he and his agent could, settle for. That would make him the second highest paid guard in the NFL. And so it'll be interesting to see, how those negotiations go. This is potentially the first big extension, at least internal extension, that we'll see from this regime. Obviously, they gave extensions to Jake Matthews and Grady Jarrett, but those were really kind of like 1-2 year extensions, not this long-term thing that we're thinking with Lindstrom, where it's going to be 5 or 6 years. It's going to have 3 or 4 years of guaranteed money across it. And it'll be interesting to see how the timing of this goes, because under the Dimitrov era, like, typically these types of extensions would later in the offseason, like, it would be July or August, or, ahead of week 1, that we would see this type of big money deal get signed. But you wonder, under this new regime under Terry Fontenot, does this deal get done sooner? Do they get this deal done in March when they have all the cap space and all the room to spend big money on a Lindstrom deal? Or do they wait until after the draft because, they're too busy, shoring up other rosters, and they put that on the back burner with Lindstrom in that negotiation? Who knows at this point in time? So it'll be interesting just to learn sort of the different quirks with this regime and how they, potentially negotiate these internal deals, extending contracts for the players, because we got a couple of extensions. You got Lindstrom this year. You got potentially AJ Terrell the year after that. You got Kyle Pitts the year after that. So it's one of those things where we may see, this will be the sort of the precedent that is set potentially for things moving ahead. So that'll be fascinating from that point. Obviously, Chris Lindstrom is deserving of all the money this year, and certainly given the Falcons offensive line issues, he will have some leverage in this negotiation, where it's like, like, what are you going to do, let me walk in free agency? And of course, like, the answer to that's a non-starter, given all the turmoil we've had at that unit these last couple of years. So he certainly will have a strong negotiation stance, and we'll see, how much his agent and whatnot, push the boundaries with that negotiation. But ultimately, I think the Falcons will basically, if he wants $20 million a year, like, are they going to say no? Like, no. So we'll see how that all goes, guys. But that will do it for us here on today's Locked On Falcons podcast. Really appreciate you guys for tuning in. Thank you for making us your first listen. Please make sure you subscribe to Locked On Falcons on YouTube. We got to get that subscription numbers up, guys. And of course, in addition to making Locked On Falcons your first listen, check out Locked On Sports Atlanta as your second listen, as well as Locked On Sports Today, where you can get the lowdown on not only just the NFL, but all the big stories from across sports in just under 25 minutes each and every day on Locked On Sports Today. Subscribe to it on YouTube or wherever you get your podcasts. And guys, really, again, appreciate it. Tomorrow, we're supposed to have Charles McDonald. He's ducked us twice now over the last 2 weeks. Hopefully, with third time's a charm, and we'll get him, and we'll get his input on the Falcons season, as well as his expectations for Desmond Ridder on tomorrow's episode. And then, of course, we'll have crossover Thursday with Locked On Saints host Ross Jackson. And then we'll be joined by Jarvis Davis on Friday's episode here of the ATL Day Ones podcast to get his thoughts on sort of the key to victory. And we'll talk a little bit more about Desmond Ridder, I'm sure, in that episode coming up on Friday. So, guys, again, really appreciate you for making Locked On Falcons your first listen, one of the illustrious podcasts here on the Locked On Sports Atlanta podcast family, your team every day.